Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Streetscape, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ryan here today. Would you please join me in giving Ryan Gravel a warm New Zealand welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Paul, and to Streetscape for having me, to Henry and especially Jan for coordinating this visit. It's a real honor to be here. It's so inspiring, today's conversation about especially just really struck by the role of designers in achieving or trying to achieve social justice for Indigenous people. And it's something that I'll definitely be taking back home and thinking about what the implications for that would be. We would always also in the States have to add a layer of the justice for the enslavement of African people. And so another sort of complexity that we're definitely a part of how we think about cities, and certainly a city like Atlanta want to, and we'll get back to that in a minute, actually. But anyway, I'm struck by so many overlapping issues that we've talked about today: the population growth and urbanization, economic and cultural displacement, the role of community in creating change and managing change for themselves. All over the world, you're seeing this. And so, as we shift to the theme of movement, I wanted to make sure that we're not thinking of movement as something separate from the previous theme of culture and community, that they're very much intertwined, and that the tools of movement have dramatic implications for our culture and our community. And in fact, the best projects, best mobility projects actually use culture and community to define what they are, who they're for, and what kind of city they're building. And so it's an honor for me to be here to share my work in Atlanta with you all today. If you don't know what Atlanta is or where we come from, just think Coca-Cola, Dr. King, and traffic. That's about what most people think. My book is called Where We Want to Live. It came out a couple years ago. Isn't that where you want to live? My idea was to think about how, I grew up in Atlanta, and I grew up basically stuck in a traffic jam going to the mall. And when I started thinking about where I wanted to live the rest of my life and build a career, I wanted to think about how you would make Atlanta into the kind of place that I did want to live. And that's what this book is about. I didn't realize that I was writing a book about my grandma, but I was. And I'll get back to her in a minute, because while my story starts with my grandma, my book begins with a year abroad in Paris. I was studying architecture, and my friend says I look like a French anarchist. But this is still what I see when I look in the mirror in the morning. There's no better place to be 22 and figuring out what you want to do with your life in the world, especially in design. But what was really striking was that within a month of being there, I had lost 15 pounds. I was in the best shape of my life because I was walking everywhere and I was eating fresh food. Miracle, right? And so it really got me thinking about the role of the built environment of the city in my own personal health and well-being, that the city itself enabled a lifestyle that was healthy and sustainable. And I was definitely sort of fascinated by the construction of the city, that the grand boulevards that were built in Paris in the 1860s came at a great cost to the people who were living in those communities at the time, but they also came with great social benefits. They opened up narrow streets for public health reasons. They had wide sidewalks and paved surfaces. They brought water and sewer, street trees and public spaces, fountains, eventually electric street lighting and subways. And that infrastructure created everything that you think about Paris: the wide sidewalk cafes, the cafe culture and arts. History of Paris really came out of that, was a result of that physical infrastructure, or was enabled by that physical infrastructure. And I became really fascinated with the role of infrastructure in shaping not just ways to move people from point A to point B, but or convey water or sewer, but that infrastructure creates our way of life. It makes a way of life possible. It also limits the way that we live, depending on what we build. So I was looking at other cities, the great industrial cities of the north in the United States, and the infrastructure built to tap into natural resources and build lives for people. And again, they were building a way of life at that time during my grandmother's time, and actually, of course, cities at that time were very different than they are today, very dirty with pollution and social unrest, overcrowd. This is the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland on fire, which happened multiple times because of the chemical pollution. Overcrowded housing conditions and social unrest at that time made cities a place that was less desirable to be. And culturally, that the result was that people wanted to get away from cities, and that people who could, because of their privilege, did do that. And that brings me to my grandparents. So my grandparents live in a small town in Louisiana, and my grandfather was a banker, and his boss, when they got married in 1941, his boss convinced him to buy a house out on the edge of town. It looks like every other picture of suburban America, but this was small town Louisiana. They bought in a house with no sidewalks. They rented rooms to servicemen during World War II. They probably got one of those fancy federal home loans that was only available to white people. And they participated in an American story of suburbanization that radically and fundamentally changed the way we build cities. They weren't thinking about that at that time, of course. They were laying the groundwork, the foundation for urban sprawl, but they didn't call it sprawl. They called it the future. And it was. And you can't separate the physical construction of the world around us from the other things that were happening at that time. At that time, science was curing disease and lifting us to the moon, and the sexual revolution was breaking down barriers, and the civil rights movement had begun its march toward the fulfillment of America's promise. And all of those things are happening at the very same time that we're rebuilding roadways for cars. We're creating new geometries for driving, new surfaces for driving on highways. We're under construction. Basically, the public sector was innovating in the construction of highways, the surfaces, geometries, and all that for highways. And the private sector, and home loans and all kinds of other federal policies. And the private sector was innovating in not only cars, but also air conditioning and entertainment and food systems and all kinds of other things that those two forces together basically colluded to give us the lives that we wanted, at least the people who were making decisions at that time. And ultimately really radically changed the way that cities were built. And that brings me back to my story, which is when my parents moved us from Louisiana to Metro Atlanta in the early 70s, when I was a little kid. And they did it because of the booming highways. The highways that Atlanta was building around itself were creating an economic opportunity that was lifting people to prosperity, and they came to be a part of that. So we bought a house in a neighborhood that was incentivized by the construction of our perimeter highway. My dad took a job with an engineering firm designing pump stations and wastewater treatment plants to support the sprawling economy of the region. Literally, those highways put dinner on our table, sent me to college. It did what city building infrastructure is supposed to do. It wasn't available to everybody, but it did create economic opportunity and a lifestyle for people that worked for a while at that time. And of course, it radically changed the way that we build cities, and we're stuck now, maybe, with a kind of infrastructure and a way of life that a lot of us don't really want. So you have to wonder, if you understand that cycle of change, the cultural sort of side of things, and the physical form that reflects how the city changes us, and how then we make decisions about the city. You have to wonder if we're stuck with it. Are we stuck with this kind of dystopian traffic and environmental degradation, the urban decline and displacement, with the suburbanization of poverty, which is very clear right now in Atlanta and cities across the US, and the social isolation and real political polarization that is a direct result, at least partial result, of the physical nature of our communities. We don't have to talk about our national politics right now, but it certainly reflects a polarization of people because we don't see each other anymore. We've separated ourselves from each other. We don't ever look each other in the eye, and we don't know each other anymore. And that plays a role in that. So the Beltline, obviously, when I was in school, wasn't really thinking about all that, but it creates a context for this pretty amazing, remarkable story about what we're doing in Atlanta right now. As Paul said, the Atlanta Beltline started as my graduate thesis. I did a joint degree with planning and architecture at Georgia Tech. And the idea is to take this loop of mostly underutilized, abandoned railroads circling this Atlanta and transform it into some kind of life-affirming new infrastructure again. Again, inspired by that year in Europe, to repurpose it for public transportation that would revitalize neighborhoods in the city and spur on the redevelopment of a lot of abandoned urban industrial land that had been left behind by sprawl. So the project is actually made up of 4 different railroads that roughly form a loop. It's 35 kilometers in circumference. It's 3 to 5 kilometers out from downtown in any direction. There's 45 neighborhoods around it. So these were built before the city had expanded out that far, out in the country. And so one neighborhood is on one side of the tracks, and literally the other side of the neighborhood is the other side of the tracks. Often historically different socioeconomic community. About 100,000 people currently within walking distance, and all that yellow land is the old industrial land is about 2,000 hectares. You can see how close it is to the city, but not in the center city. And then even though you're that close, in some places it feels like you're out in the country. It's really kind of wild. So it was an idea I had in school. Never imagined we would actually build it. Went to work for an architecture firm. We were doing mixed-use urban infill projects in the city because after a generation of decline, the city of Atlanta lost about 1/5 of its population to suburbanization and white flight. The city at that time, by the late 90s, early 2000s, was starting to grow again. And so we were doing this one project where we're trying to decide, do you take the parking garage and jam it up against the abandoned railroad? Or do you orient it toward the railroad, hoping it would become something, that corridor would become something better one day? And I was telling my coworkers about this idea I had in school for that very railroad, and they thought, that's cool, because they live in neighborhoods nearby, and we're doing lots of work in that corridor. And so we started talking about the project, or the idea. And the more people we talked to, the more people wanted to hear about it, and so we started talking to more people. And in the summer of 2001, we sent out a letter with some maps to everybody who could think of, the governor, the mayor, all the regional planning agencies, the State Department of Transportation. Got a lot of nice letters back saying, nice idea, good luck with that. But got a great response from Kathy Woolard. She was on city council. She was chair of the transportation committee. And they usually deal with the airport, but she was interested in public transit, and she'd had all the regional agencies come in and say, what are you doing for people who live in the city, in the urban core of Atlanta? And they had all had ideas about moving people from way outside of town into downtown and back home at the end of the day, not really for people who live in the city, who are more likely to want it, more likely to ride it, more likely to pay for it. Had been paying for it for 30 years with our transit agency at that time. And a large proportion of people who are dependent on transit to get around because they can't afford a car. There were basically no ideas for those people. And she was frustrated by that. And that day she went back to her office and this letter was on her desk. And she thought, wow, this is for people in the city. So she called us in and we told her more about the concept. And she said, let's see what happens. So we had a town hall meeting in a church basement in her neighborhood. And the people fell in love with this idea for their future. And so we started talking about it more. And she was elected city council president. We took that conversation citywide. And literally for the next 2.5 years, I was doing 3 and 4 meetings a week. And so was she and her staff and a handful of volunteers. And we created this amazing grassroots movement of people who saw a vision for their future that was better than what they saw through their car windshields. And they were really inspired by that. And it sort of started pulling more people together. We had a coalition built of 3 primary groups of people. One were community activists who had mostly been fighting against things and found the Beltline as something they could fight for. Developers, of course, who wanted to make a buck. And all the nonprofit organizations in the city, whether they're advocates for housing or trees or pedestrians or bikes or whatever the issue is, they saw themselves as part of fulfilling their mission as part of a larger kind of shared vision. And and those people are not used to being at the same table wanting the same outcome. I'm sure that's similar here. But it's really remarkable and really powerful to see everybody come behind this kind of idea. And it started to take on a life of its own. So in 3 parts, the transportation, both a tram and a multi-use trail for the full 35-kilometer loop. Economic development, not only in the parts of town that were already getting that new investment, but also in parts of town that hadn't seen anything new in 30 or 40 years. And then connecting existing parks and cultural spaces. The zoo is on the corridor, the botanical gardens, those kinds of things. What was crazy is that the more people got involved, the bigger the idea got. So the Trust for Public Land, which is a national land conservation organization, got involved in 2004 and they said, that's cute that you guys want to connect 700 acres of existing parks, but what about building 1,400 acres of new parks carved out of that old industrial belt? The mayor at the time said, what better place for affordable housing than on a transit line where you can ditch your car? And now it's one of the largest affordable housing initiatives in the city's history. That's great for new housing, but what about people who are already in these communities on low and fixed income? And we haven't done enough, but we are building a toolkit to help people stay in their homes. Whether then public art or preservation, the ideas, different kinds of ideas started to layer on. Trees Atlanta came up with an idea of a 22-mile, 35-kilometer linear arboretum. It's a public health project. It's a brownfield remediation project. You can imagine the ideas keep going. And now everybody wants to be a part of it. The Bocce Ball Association wants to put bocce ball courts around it, and the farmers market people want to put farmers markets around it. And it's cool to see that because the community kind of owns the idea, they're also authors in what the idea is. And that's really fun to watch, especially as we build it out. So I'd bore you to death with all the people that it takes to put on the project. But the cool thing is that we're not just drawing pretty pictures, we're actually building it. This is the East Side Trail, the first mainline trail section to open. It's about 3 kilometers. It just got extended. This is the Fourth Ward Park, so this is one of the new parks. This one doubles as a stormwater retention facility. It stops the downstream areas from flooding. It saved the city $13 million. They were otherwise going to build an underground storage tank, so now they get a park as well. You can see the dark lines there are the trails that are built. We don't have any transit yet, but we did pass a referendum to pay for the transit, so that's all underway. And you can see the build out until 2030, the project completion. So we're still in the early stages of building it. We've spent about $500 million, mostly on land acquisition for new parks and trail construction. In the same time period, we've seen over $4 billion of private investment. So from an economic standpoint, it's definitely a win, including this building, which is one of the largest buildings in the southeastern United States, 2 million square feet. Huge building, now has a massive food hall on the bottom and retail and all the hot tech firms locating here, and it's directly on the corridor. More important, of course, than the economics is the quality of life and the way that it's changing, that we're building infrastructure, yes, but we're also building a way of life for ourselves that was better than what we had before. And this shows you what that transformation looks like. This is the corridor. You can see the old Sears building in the background. This is in 2009. This is basically what it looks like today. And I was out on my, taking my kids on a bike ride, and they were up ahead of me, and I'm in the back, taking pictures on my phone, trying not to have a wreck. And I got home, and I was flipping through my pictures. I decided that this is my favorite picture I've ever taken of the project, and after 15 years of working on it at that time. It's not because it's a beautiful spring day and the leaves had just popped out and the sky is this beautiful blue. It's not because it's a particularly good picture. It's not because people are walking by literally talking about how in love they are with Atlanta. It's because of this woman right here with the red hair. She's carrying her groceries, and in the process, she's validating everything that we said the project would do, that it's making a way of life possible that really just wasn't possible before. And that's before the project is even done. It's before we finish the whole loop. It's before the running shoulder is built, the trail is finished. It's before all the ramps and stairs are in. It's before the transit is built. That picture was before the Sears building reopened. So you imagine how much change has already come, and then you look ahead at how much more change is almost definitely going to come, and it's just really exciting and scary to think about. Which gets me back to my story, because about a year ago, I had to take my kids with me to the grocery store, and they were complaining about it, like, oh, Dad, they didn't want to get in the car. They're like, if we have to go, can we at least ride our bikes? And I was like, yeah, we can ride our bikes. That's what people in Atlanta do. We ride our bikes to the grocery store. And they don't know how ridiculous that is, but I do, and I also know how powerful it is that that's their expectation, not only for Atlanta, but for wherever they choose to live their lives, that it's the kind of place that they can ride their bikes to the grocery store. And of course, because of where we live on the Beltline and that there are a couple grocery stores to pick from, we can, and it's the healthiest, most sustainable way to get there, and the fastest. So they figured that one out too. But that's exciting to see how that kind of change is coming. I'm going to flip pretty quickly through some other slides to show you, because of the success of the Beltline, and I'm happy to answer any questions later about it, either as part of this or later in the day. But because of the success, I get to come places like Auckland and share our story, and everywhere I go, there's something happening that's similarly transformational. It's not always as big or as big of an idea, but there's always something where you can see people reclaiming old bits of infrastructure, degraded, things and discarded land and reclaiming those things for something special, and in the process kind of redefining not only what those things are, but what kinds of lives they want to lead, and putting in place the infrastructure and public space to achieve those kinds of outcomes. And it's really inspiring. So all of these are not perfect examples, but I'm sort of particularly focused on linear corridors, obsolete railroads, abandoned railroads, but also degraded urban waterways and roadways. This is a High Line in New York, which you're probably more likely familiar with, only a mile and a half long, elevated railroad structure in west side of Manhattan that's been reclaimed as a city park. And all of these projects have both the sort of upside of economic investment and the downside of gentrification, which certainly lots to talk about there. And it's certainly the case with the High Line and the Beltline for that matter. This is in Philadelphia, the rail park. It's a third of it is underground in this beautiful tunnel. Another third lifts up over the city. In Chicago, an old elevated railroad also, but they add on the layer of a bike trail, like the Beltline. The Queensway, similarly in New York, another project there. But in Toronto, they're looking at this power line easement. They're reclaiming the space underneath that for community gardens and a greenway and playgrounds. In Minneapolis, like the Beltline, a sunken railroad below street grade. And the trail is built, but also the space on the left is reserved for a future transit line. Same thing in Detroit, the DeQuinder Cut, trail on the right, future transit on the left. In Salt Lake City, they built the transit, and that's what it looks like. This is a very short project, or small project relative to ours, but that's basically what ours will look like. We have a little bit more space between the tram and the trail, and unfortunately, we don't have the beautiful mountain range in the distance, but that's the idea there. I was in Singapore a few years ago, and they have a 15-mile abandoned railroad across their whole country island, and they're looking at the Beltline as a primary model for what they want to do with it. Not only the physical transformation of the corridor itself, but they want to create an infrastructure that supports the communities along the way and gives them the life that they want, which is really, really cool to see. Of course, they just have money, so they're going to just build it. They don't have to wait like we do. In New Orleans, the Lafitte corridor was originally a portage route between the backside of the French Quarter, between the Bayou St. John and the backside of the French Quarter. That's how they brought the service into the French Quarter. Then they dug it out as a canal for the same purpose for 150 years. Then they filled in the canal and built a railroad, and then they abandoned the railroad for a generation. And it just reopened last summer as the Lafitte Greenway. In Miami, there's this elevated, 10-mile elevated transit line built in the 80s, and the space below it is being rebuilt as this amazing new greenway that connects communities, increases public health, taps into the university, underserved communities, all the similar kinds of things the Beltline makes it safe, some pedestrian crossings and stuff like that. Really a great project in Miami. That's actually the before condition. In Houston, which is a very flat city with very bad soil, so the water drains very slowly, the natural bayous, the ditches that carry that water out to the sea, were, over time by the engineers sort of straightened and streamlined. They got rid of all that pesky vegetation. They wanted to get all the water as fast out to the ocean as possible so that the city wouldn't flood. Well, of course, that didn't work. The city still floods. And so now they're rethinking that strategy and reclaiming these bayous, which since then have been degraded with highways and power lines and all kinds of other things also. But reclaiming this for people and habitat and art and all kinds of things like the Beltline. It's a really beautiful project there in Houston. The one I love the most, though, is the Los Angeles River. Who even knew LA had a river, except every post-apocalyptic movie coming out of Hollywood. But it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful now, and because I'm just kind of funny that way. But it's a concrete channel. It's a 51-mile concrete channel. It was built in the 1930s. The river used to flood the city, and the engineers got a hold of it to stop the flooding, which they did. But I guess what I love about the LA River is that it illustrates this point of culture change. So it's not just the physical change of the river into something more life-affirming. It'll never be a wild river again because it would flood downtown. But it could be something more life-affirming. But it's not just the physical transformation of that. It's also changing the way that we think about LA, what our expectations are for that place. And more than that, it's changing the way that the agencies and organizations that, both on the public and private sector side, build the world around us. The Army Corps of Engineers, which channelized the LA River in the 1930s, just agreed a couple years ago to a $1 billion restoration of one little piece of the river. So you see that they're changing their way that they make decisions, that our cultural expectations are enabling them, empowering them, and ultimately obligating them to also change their behavior and change the way that they do things. So that as we do more of these kinds of things, we'll get better outcome at leadership level as well. And that's really, I think the power of that is really incredible. And LA has really taken on the LA River as a new symbol for its future, which is really inspiring. But they don't have to be gigantic, multi-trillion-dollar projects like the LA River. They can be much more simple. This is a beautiful project in Indianapolis. It is a loop of streets around downtown. They basically had streets that were so wide and not enough cars to fill it, so they gave some of that space back to people. And in this really beautiful little loop around downtown, it reframes connectivity in the city. It's organized around some of their cultural institutions. And it's really changed the way that people think about and reasons to go downtown, which is really cool. And of course, this isn't my picture, but it's one of the most exciting things I was interested in seeing while I was here. So I took a walk this morning out on the light path. It was pretty cool to see. But the reclaiming of roadway infrastructure, I think in particular, is a fascinating topic for the future, especially in cities that were built by cars and by roads. How we reclaim that space for people, and some of that certainly will include cars, but it'll be focused on the people in the cars instead of the cars themselves, and primarily it'll be about everybody else. So really cool to see that, and to see that those kinds of transformations also happening here. I won't bore you with all this, but in my book I did take all these projects and sort of draw out of them some ideas, some sort of best practices for how we should be thinking about these projects. And no one of them does all of these things exceptionally well. But one is to think big, that big ideas, not really, doesn't have to be big geographically or expensive. It just has to be a big idea so that you're drawing people to it. Because if it's something that is not inspiring, you're not going. It's going to be hard to get the support that you need. But in a way, the more audacious the idea, the better. The best projects include everyone, and that means and trail projects are particularly bad about this because they're usually focused on trail users, the people who are actually riding their bikes or running on the trail. But they should think about everybody else too, people who will never step foot on the trail. What's the impact on the community? What kinds of places are there along the way that would also support those communities? Promoting authenticity, most of these projects tie people back to that place, the reason for being. LA is where it is because of the river. Atlanta is a railroad town, that's why we exist. So they're connecting people back to the history. The change is not the thing itself, it's the life that you change with it. So I won't sort of go through all those too much, but you get this idea. I wanted to talk about another project that I've been working on in Atlanta. The Beltline kind of established this question of what kind of city do we want to be? What kind of place are we? And Atlanta's unlike a city like, say, Sydney for sure, San Francisco, or New York, something that has a very clear kind of civic identity, that has a clear sense of place, a dramatic kind of landscape to organize itself around. Atlanta's just kind of a different kind of a place. And I was lucky enough to be hired by the city to lead a project called the Atlanta City Design, which was to think about how we're going, because we're like Auckland and Sydney and everywhere here, we heard this morning, changing dramatically. It'll be a fundamentally different place in 20 years. And how do we leverage that change to create a better place, to create a better version of Atlanta, not some other kind of city that we don't like or recognize anymore? But if we don't know who we are, it's hard to project forward what we want that to be. And so we spent some time looking at who we are, our civic identity, and then looking forward about how we could do more of that. And unlike a lot of cities that have tapped in sort of directly with their physical landscape, the concept that we kept coming back to in Atlanta was that Atlanta's contribution to the world is the legacy of the civil rights movement, and what Dr. King meant when he talked about the beloved community, which was not a place, not a utopian idea, not some dreamscape, but an actual place. And he used the term aftermath, that the aftermath of the civil rights movement was the beloved community, an actual place where people lived together, not without conflict, but where people had a respect for each other and a process for living with each together to resolve conflict so that they could all, so everybody could be a part of it. So the idea for the future of the city was built very fundamentally on this idea of a city designed and built for everyone. And so rather than organize all the things that we do in the traditional silos that planners like me usually organize them around, transportation, housing, art, whatever you want to call it, those different silos. Instead of that, we extracted out of our history, out of our identity of who we are, 5 core values. And our values of who we are when we're at our best, not who we are when we're at our worst. We want to aspire to be better. And so we came up with these 5 values, and then everything that we do is organized around or accountable to those values. So a transportation project, a park project, would have to be accountable to, rather than to some abstract notion of what some transportation plan is, whatever that is, it's accountable to equity. And so equity, these are the 5 values. Equity is that city for everybody, designed and built for everybody. Progress is the hard work of achieving that equity, that it's not just gonna happen on its own. We have to actually work hard and compromise to achieve it. The third is ambition, which is our motivation for doing that hard work, and Atlanta is a particularly ambitious kind of place. Access is the physical infrastructure to create those opportunities for that work, and nature, of course, is our ultimate foundation, our place in the world, and how that fits together. Those 2 last things, the physical side of it, access and nature, started to form a physical framework for how that would be applied to this place. And most people, especially people who live in Atlanta, have no idea what Atlanta's all about, because the way that they organize themselves physically in the city, spatially, is by the highways. Well, the highways completely ignore every topographic thing about the city, every waterway and everything. They completely disregard anything natural about this place. So we didn't draw the highways on any map in this whole 400-page book. And we organize it instead around the inherent nature of the city, because when you look at how it's built, it actually makes sense. It sits high on a ridge. It's 1,000 feet over sea level. On one side of the city, the water flows to the Gulf of Mexico. On the other side, to the Atlantic Ocean. And it was the railroads came up and bridged that divide. That's why the city exists up there. And the streets flow out in every direction. So the idea is to grow that future population in the core. The city will nearly triple its population in the next 20 years. And then along the corridors, along the roadways it's sort of a hub and spoke kind of system. The growth would also go out those corridors, and then all that space would be designed for people. And then all the space in between, which is the green, that's the leafy green canopy neighborhoods, they're going to stay more or less like they are. They're still going to grow, but at a scale sort of below the tree line. So we protect the incredible tree canopy that we do have, which you can see there. So the growth happens in that yellow band, stringing out in every direction. And that's designed for people to live in higher densities. And then the lower density neighborhoods sort of complement that. So with any community within a walking distance, you can live in a house, in a backyard garage apartment, in a townhouse, in a multi-story apartment, in a high-rise. You can meet your friend at lunch. You can catch the bus into town. All of that in every sort of community throughout the city. So that's kind of a cool idea. And then for the different projects, this is a quarry that's being transformed into a 350 acre park. For every project, we would look at it through the lens of our core values and make sure that it's accountable to that. As an example, a different park, not this one, one of the projects that we proposed in the city design was a big park, what has ultimately become a 1,400 hectare park just south of the city, about 6 kilometers from the center city. And it was just an idea. It was a line on a map and a paragraph in that project. But since then, the Nature Conservancy hired me to take that idea to the next level, articulate what that is, what it would be, who it would be for, how it would serve, what kinds of things you could do with it, what kinds of stakeholders would need to be involved, how the community would be impacted, because of course there's surrounded by a lot of low-income communities of color, making sure that they are part of it, not only the process, but they actually are beneficiaries of the economic lift that it would create for the city. So, and we're framing all the outcomes around those 5 values, which is pretty cool. Just a note, if you want to see that document and see what that's all about, you can go to atlcitydesign.com. And so I'll just end the last couple minutes on why all of this matters, why I think my work matters. I don't want to be, too cheesy with you guys, but, it's about our kids. They're the future or whatever. They are. Obviously, I believe that. But also, it's a way of life it's what we're leaving them, and it's a way of life that we're creating for them, And, I don't usually play my violin walking down the trail, tugging my dog on the back of a cooler. But this lady is out there all the time, and she is living the life that she wants, and she's making the rest of our lives richer in the process. And it's amazing to see the life that's happening on these corridors when we think about a trail, basically at this point, being inclusive and including all kinds of people and the lives that they want. So it's also my life, my morning commute, my sweet dog's last walk. At every season and every time of day, people out there just living their lives. And there are definitely people out there getting exercise. There are definitely people out there going to work, commuting to work. But I love to watch people out on dates, women in heels. They're not out for exercise. They're having fun. They're going out for that night. And there's restaurants opening in the loading docks of the old industrial buildings all up and down the way. It's fascinating to sit in a coffee shop and eavesdrop on especially young people who are organizing their whole lives around it. The Beltline makes decisions for them about where they live, where they work, who they date, what they do on the weekends. It's fascinating to hear all that happen. It's really incredible. This is my daughter on the right with the blue helmet. That's her worldview. So I grew up stuck in traffic, going to the mall. This is her worldview, and this is not some special event. This is your average weekday winter afternoon, and that's her expectation for Atlanta and for her life, which is pretty amazing. This is a woman I met a few years ago. She's a fashion designer, a new business owner, and she likes the Beltline. She's like, oh, yeah, the transit, trails, parks, all that's nice and all that, but what she was really excited about was the economic opportunities it was going to open for her business and for her family, that the Beltline will do for her what those highways did for my parents and our family, except in obviously a much more sustainable and inclusive way, which is super cool to hear about. This is another project, the Lantern Parade. This woman had this crazy idea that a parade is something that you participate in, not something that you merely watch, and that people would make homemade lanterns and walk down the trail in the dark. And the first year she did it, there were about 200 people showed up, which I thought was pretty cool. The second year, there were 400 people. This next year, there were 800 people. The next year, there were 1,200 people. The next year, there were 12,000 people. The next year, there were 20,000 people. The next year, there were 60,000 people. Last September, there were over 80,000 people literally out there with homemade lanterns walking down the trail in the dark. It's an amazing sea of humanity flowing down this very narrow trail. You could walk probably 6 abreast, packed tightly, and just watch people for hours going by. It's free, it's families, and it illustrates a pent-up demand for a cultural life in a city that you wouldn't have gotten without that basically 2-mile slab of concrete. So when you talk about infrastructure and the cultural side of infrastructure, that's what I'm talking about. Like it's not the thing itself, it's the life that it enables and the lifestyle and the city that it builds for us. And obviously, I think that matters quite a bit. We've got a long way to go, and we're struggling with a lot of kinds of questions. And the important thing is that we're talking about them, and that we're not only talking about them, but that we're also acting and making change in the world. So thank you for the opportunity to share my story with you today, and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
We've got a couple more minutes, and I just thought I'll break the rules a little bit and just slip in a couple of questions.
Sure, yeah.
Later on. And I've got when you're designing something that's 30 kilometres long, and in terms of how you think about the linearity and the
What's funny? Yeah. Linearia? Yeah. Well, actually, I was on the design team that did the preliminary design for the corridor, and you know, I think most of you would probably identify with this, that you can have all the great ideas in the world, and they may not get implemented by your client. So, unfortunately, I don't have the. I'm not in control of the Beltline. I'm not even directly involved with it anymore, and that's another whole story. But we did have a lot of really beautiful ideas, some of which were implemented, which is about sort of the, there's the, one thing that's really beautiful about the Beltline as a public space is that it was a barrier between communities, a physical, real barrier between places. And now it's this meeting ground, so it's a space where people come together. So you're not only connecting with communities along the line, but you're physically doing it across the tracks. And literally, you go out there now where it's built, and people like come in from either side. It's like real. It's like we talk about it. So there's all kinds of ideas about the interweaving of the public space, the trail, public spaces along the way, the transit, the transit stations where they are, access up and down. Atlanta's a very hilly city, but the railroad track is flat, so you've got a lot of topography to deal with, but it allows free-flowing movement through most of the city. There's probably 70 street crossings along the way, and most of them, all but a handful, are grade separated, which is really great experience along the corridor. And because the city's hilly and the corridor is flat, you get to really experience the hilliness of the city and the differences. Sometimes you're way up high above the neighborhood, and sometimes you're down low in a cut. And so the role of what we did is we created, so it creates a natural sense of sequence of spaces. And so we just identified what the spaces were and then articulated them through the landscape design. I was working at Perkins & Will, but our co-partner was Field Operations from New York, and they just had all kinds of incredible ideas about how we could articulate the spaces. And then we had a typologies for all the elements. So while the experiential quality changed along the way naturally with the different communities, different conditions, the infrastructure of it, the railings, the signage, the benches and those kinds of things was uniform, so that it was recognizable from one side of town to the other. And then also reflecting the difference was public art and lighting and things like that. So,
I guess just one related one, I guess, the question that's come through is, what sort of governance model sits in behind being able to sort of roll something out that presumably runs across several different agencies and territories within the city?
Yeah, we are lucky in that the entire loop is all within the city of Atlanta, so it's one jurisdiction that we have to deal with. The political simplicity stops there because we are part of we touch 23 of the 24 what we call neighborhood planning districts, which is the lowest level of city government community panels. 11 of the 12 city council districts, and so internally to the city, very complex. You know, the way that is managed mostly is that people love the project, and so, you know, the complexity of it, you know, they're kind of obligated to overcome and figure it out. You know, people, because the public owns it and they want it so much, because it's so popular, they're going to elect people who want it. Our last mayor, who was just termed out, and we have a new mayor now, but when he was elected in 2009, you couldn't be a viable candidate for mayor without supporting the project and having some plan for how you were going to do it better and faster, which is a really great place to be. And so that is what moves the project. That's why we were able to vote for the transit referendum, and that's kind of what holds the integrity of the project together, is that you've got a lot of different people with a lot of different interests all wanting the same thing, and they hold each other accountable, and they hold the project sort of together. So, great. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ryan. And thanks very much.